Welcome, everybody, to the Physiology, Brain Science, and Energetics of Spiritual Awakening. So, emotional pain transforms to power, wisdom, and wholeness. So glad to be able to talk to you today. So, a little bit about me. I'm Carolyn Eberly, and I'm the founder of the Mind Energy Body School of Transformation. And that picture there is of the book I've written quite a few years ago, I guess it is now, called The Explorer's Mind, A Map to Freedom. It's available on Amazon. So I'm a licensed professional counselor and got my MA in counseling about a decade ago. I also do horse-initiated psychotherapy. I am a teacher graduate of the Barbara Brennan School of Healing. Studied Qigong, Reiki, Healing Touch, massage, meditation teacher, spiritual traveler, and a somatic body-centered trauma therapist. I'm also a brain science enthusiast and a former Washington, D.C. lobbyist for the underprivileged. I've traveled around the world and I work for the Asia Foundation doing women empowerment program. And I'm just happy to be here and share this time together and talk more about the energetics and the awakening process of spirituality, because I'm a consciousness nerd and I just enjoy this topic and this work so much that it's just an honor to be able to spend time with you today. So my story created my gifts. This is a painting that's in my healing center that a former student created of me. She didn't know she was creating this picture for me. She just knew she was painting it for a teacher of hers. And the light part of it represents the energetics of who we really are. And the dark part is that wounded part that prevents us from that spiritual awakening process. And so when she said, listen, I think I created this painting for you. It was created for the teacher I was looking for. And I was really astonished when I saw it, because right here is a picture of me when I was that age. Even the shoes are the same color dress and the socks. So I show this to you to help you know that there's so much more than what we see around of us and what we think we see, and that there is a magical world we live in. And as you learn how to transform that pain to power, as you learn to wake up and understand the physiology of the brain and body and the energetics and learn how to use them as an awakening tool, anything becomes possible. So first I want to talk about what is spiritual awakening. So for the purposes of this talk, I define spiritual awakening as the ability to access wisdom, your true self, your spiritual wholeness, which I call the core being, kindness and personal power during emotionally painful and stressful times. In some ways, people like to talk about enlightenment being spiritual awakening. And personally, my current definition of enlightenment is the ability to self-regulate your mind, energy, and body systems back to wholeness. It's not that most of us can maintain that higher vibration of consciousness, of an awakened state 24/7, because of some of the research I'm going to talk about today. Our brain and body systems and energy systems go to a lower default, yet we can get better at self-regulating back to our wholeness throughout the day. We lose it, we come back. We lose it, we come back as you become more conscious and more aware. And the picture here is of my dogs and I on a walk. It has some orbs in the picture, and the light felt so celestial, so symbolic of spiritual awakening, that I wanted to use it here. And I think nature is a representation of the spiritual awakening, the divine mother of wholeness that nature so does a great job of representing. So I'm going to discuss the research that helps you understand that you can transform emotional pain, life challenge, back to power in all three mind, energy, and body systems. So what we'll do today is I'll discuss what the research says about the benefits of mindfulness and subtle energy awareness. I'll also discuss the brain and body systems, how they can be wired and activated to either support spiritual awakening or prevent it. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit more about what is the actual energetic frequency of spiritual awakening and what is the energy of wholeness, illness, trauma, emotional pain, and the false self? Because if we want to awaken, we have to understand what is not the awakened state. And how can our unawakened state, those conditions around the unawakened state, such as the trauma we suffered or the emotional pain in the moment or the ego and false self, how can they actually become energetic portals to help us reclaim our wholeness? We'll also discuss, can your brain and biology get wired so that you never ever self-identify as your false self, which I call the program personality. And this is a really important point of that concept of self-identity. In Buddhism, we talk about there not being a self, that you shouldn't have a self, that you're working toward a no self. Yet I found that just like my son needed a transitional blanket when he would go to bed at night and I would be separate from him, most of us need a sense of self to help us navigate the rough waters of life and to self-identify as our false self, which I call the program personality, can actually hold you back in life. And we'll talk about the research around that. Whereas accessing and self-identifying as your spiritual wholeness can really launch you forward. And what does the research say about that? And also, I want to discuss and support you around how negative emotions like depression, anxiety, anger, fear can actually change the consciousness. That the consciousness of those negative emotions can transform. So I say pain to power, so that anxiety, anger, fear can transform to courage, sense of empowerment and safety. And we'll talk more about that. Let's see what the research says. Okay? So the false self versus the higher self. I want to talk a little bit about that. And I think this picture does a great job of helping you understand that what we think we are is usually so much different than what we really are when we're not in that awakened state. And there's a reason for that. The brain and body can really hold us back into a disenfranchised state. And object relations theory is one reason why, when we were first born, how we bonded with our mother helps define how we think about ourselves. For instance, in object relations theory, the first 6 months or so of life, there is no differentiation between you and your mom. Your sense of self is your mom's. And as that separation occurs between you and your mom, and you get older and you start differentiating and you see there is a separate self from who your mom is, all sorts of crazy making concepts and emotional pain and challenge can create and foster a false understanding of who you are. There is a separation. In fact, I would say that there's even a separation between who you think you are and who you really are before birth. But that's another story, and they really don't have a lot of research on that, so I'm just going to put that aside for now, and let's talk a little bit about how trauma and life experiences really shape your brain and body systems that prevent you from really knowing who you are, from really understanding that spiritual awakening. So trauma and challenging life experiences can either anchor you into a biological programming. I call it the biological consciousness container, because how your physiology is built and how your sense of self is designed and how your brain and body systems work together are indicative of whether you are going to have an easier time of reclaiming your spiritual wholeness and awakening, or a more difficult time because of how that brain and body systems evolve over your lifetime. DNA also affects your ability to awaken. DNA can decide whether you're shy or outgoing. DNA programs so much of who you are, but it's more complicated than that. Some of the groundbreaking work that Bruce Lipton has done talks about biology is not your destiny. It is the blueprint that creates a structure of what could happen, but it's only the blueprint. Just as the blueprint of your home creates the structure of what your home is going to look like, DNA is the blueprint of what could happen and is the design of what happened. But there's other indicators of what actually creates the expression of your DNA. Epigenetics is a wonderful example of that. Bruce Lipton talks about how what is it that creates the expression or the non-expression of your DNA. So let's say you have cancer as a potential DNA, a potential blueprint of what could be expressed. But it's more complicated. Epigenetics explains that just because you have the DNA doesn't mean the DNA will actually be expressed. And he feels that it's consciousness that determines what is expressed if the cancer happens or not. It's much more complicated than, oh, you've got the DNA. So when you're looking at that awakening experience, it is so important to understand the power, even down to the DNA, of what can and cannot actually create the reality that you live, whether you live with cancer or not with cancer. Now I want to talk a little bit about neuroplasticity. And this latest research really gives a lot of hope for spiritual awakening. It says that your brain's neural connections are not static, that you can develop new neural connections, and your brain can remodel and change in a way that can promote higher consciousness. And it's true even for adults. They knew that children's brains and adolescents' brains changed, but there was this concept that the older brain was more static, and that's just simply not true. There's so much potential available to you. So now I want to talk a little bit about oxytocin and its role in supporting spiritual awakening. It's known for its ability to help you bond with others. It is the chemical that can help relationships last longer if it's expressed. And it supports the differentiation between you and another, which also is an indicator of being more spiritually conscious. If your sense of self is not differentiated from another person's sense of self, then you're not in your own authority. You're not defining who you are. And that's a really important characteristics for coming not only into adulthood, but coming into your own personal power. And oxytocin plays a large role in your ability to do that very important task. I want to talk more about the brain. There's 3 main parts of the brain, and I think you've probably familiar with some of them. The term the reptile brain, which is the primal brain function, the nodes of the anatomic and the neurotransmitters and the sensory processing part of the brain. And then there's the mouse brain. Rick Hansen calls it the reptile, the mouse, and the monkey. So if you want to have spiritual awakening, you have to deal with all these 3 parts of the brain. The reptile, the mouse, and the monkey. Imagine them in this really small container of your head, all hanging out in there fighting with each other. And that kind of exhibits a good symbol of how difficult it is to be an awaken, just based on how the brain functions. The mouse brain is the midbrain. It's the limbic part of the brain, the emotional reactivity of the brain. And the monkey part of the brain are where the executive functions in that prefrontal cortex. So let's say the limbic brain goes off and starts having this high emotional reactivity. And it's so reactive, it actually can shut down the prefrontal cortex. So if they did an MRI of your prefrontal cortex, it wouldn't be firing. You'd only be limbic. In therapy, we talk about people going limbic. Well, if you're in a limbic state, it is much harder, just in the basics of how the brain works, to move out of a limbic state into a more awakened state. It's very difficult. And the programming of how reactive your limbic system is plays a large role in spiritual awakening, because those executive functions of the prefrontal cortex are really important in reasoning. Adolescents' brains can be more reactive. They can have less inhibitions as a result of how the teenage brain is functioned. So if you are wanting to really live in a higher state of consciousness, but your brain, because of trauma, and we'll talk a little bit more of how the limbic system can be difficult to tame based on your childhood, based on your gender even. The amygdala of a female female is much larger than the amygdala of your typical male brain, or as the male brain book says, the emotional system of a woman is like superhighways compared to back country roads for men. So how the brain is designed and how what part of the brain is being nurtured and activated throughout your day determines your ability to really awaken spiritually. So they've done some research to document that, yes, emotions can be felt in the body, and there's a commonality among the people in the research study of where they felt different emotions. And this is a diagram explaining, where anxiety tends to be held, and love and depression, and the different colors are the different temperatures. People are feeling depression as being cold, and thus the blue temperatures, and the warmer temperatures are heat sensations that they're feeling of the emotions. But basically, this is proving there is a mind-body connection, that the thoughts and emotions in the mind can, in the brain, can actually be felt in the physical body. And Candace Pert wrote a book called Molecules of Emotion that looks at the neuropeptides as the receptors for holding emotions that as they travel throughout the body. And there's also another mind-body connection of the research that's out there. One of the things that I teach my clients, that if you're lost in depression, one of the things that can help in terms of the mind-body connection is simply to take probiotics. They did this study where they looked at the resiliency of rats with they had a rat that had a lot of probiotics and another rat that was not given probiotics. And the rat that was not given probiotics, when they put the rat in a very stressful situation, they put him in water and he had to swim for a long period of time. He started panicking at a much quicker rate than the rat that had the probiotics. When the rat with the probiotics was put under those stressful conditions, he lasted longer and he didn't go into a panic mode. So the power of simply looking at the role of probiotics in that brain-body connection can really look at, wow, what do I need to do to help support my own spiritual awakening? Does it support myself to take probiotics? Fundamentally, I guess what I'm saying, that if your brain is wired to a lower level of consciousness, you can't change. I used to tell my students, blame it on the brain. You know that song, blame it on the alcohol. Instead of blaming it on the alcohol, you can blame it on the brain, because the brain actually dictates and limits your ability to foster higher consciousness based on how it is wired. It determines whether it's easier or harder. And the reason why I have a picture of this building here is because, we all know you can blow up a building and quickly, a lot quicker than it takes to build up a building. It does take time, it does take focus, it does take concerted effort for you to actually change your brain. But because of the neuroplasticity, you can change it. There's an actual location in the brain of your sense of self. And there was a study that showed that in the right frontal lobe, when people had dementia or had some injury to that area, their sense of self actually changed. They could change politics. They could change, how they like to dress. They can change the type of vocation that interests them. So they actually have found a location of the sense of self in the brain. So if there's damage or if there's building of that through neuroplasticity, you can actually change your sense of self. You can change your ability to relate and self-identify as who you are in the world. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about procedural memory. HM is one of the clients, patients they studied who lost his long-term memory. and he could only remember, 10 minutes. But he could sit down at the piano, and through something called procedural memory, he is able to actually learn how to play the piano. There is this ability to learn and grow even though the long-term memory functions don't exist. And it's a really powerful understanding of how the brain works. And I'll talk more about that in terms of different therapeutic techniques and different awakening strategies to help prompt yourself so that you can develop this procedural memory, this body-centered memory that allows you to really work toward spiritual awakening, even if you're not consciously aware of it. And I find with my students and my clients, if they have a system throughout the day, a mindfulness practice, I call it advanced mindfulness practice, that they implement throughout the day. I teach 5 steps that they do over and over again. They then create in their procedural memory a habituated pattern toward shifting from lower consciousness to higher consciousness, from the wounded or false self into the true self. And the power of understanding procedural memory it can help you. For instance, another person that they did research on in procedural memory, she too, had a very, very only short-term memory. And one time when she went to visit her doctor, she stuck out her hand to shake his hand. And he had a pin hidden. And so when she shook his hand, it pricked her. And then the next time they met, he stuck out his hand to shake her hand, and she went to shake his hand and then stopped and pulled it away because of that procedural memory. So what if you installed a procedural memory within you that shifted you out of your false sense of self into, oh, let me implement, well, what I teach are 5 steps, so that you can actually transform that emotional pain, that false sense of self, that perception of negative ego into an awakened state. So I want to talk a little bit about GABA, a study done by Daniel Siegel, who did a lot of study on the adolescent brain. So as the brain gets older, there is less GABA, and you lose GABA as the brain ages into adulthood. And the reason why that's not great is that GABA is the neurotransmitter that helps you downregulate a reactive limbic system. So when you go limbic, the GABA helps communicate from the prefrontal cortex to the limbic system the ability to move out of that reactive state quicker. And so they showed that children who had a lot of trauma actually lost GABA at a greater rate because of the trauma, so that as they aged and they normally would lose GABA, they had less GABA, less ability to self-regulate between the higher and limbic brain functions, between that monkey and that mouse brain. And that is, a problem, because it kind of has some dings against you as you want to have that more awakened state. And it's information, and I'm not going to say that, I was very traumatized as a kid, and I'm really good at self-regulating, but it took me a while to learn. So the system I'll teach you after we discuss the research is simple, not easy. It is simple and simplistic in that it only takes 5 steps to move into higher consciousness. But because of how the brain is structured, because you can't change until you actually create new neurons, and that changes your brain to higher consciousness, you have to be patient. You have to be, focused. You have to be resilient in order to succeed. So childhood trauma also wires you for fear. It makes it a more reactive state. So if you started out with more childhood trauma, you can have a harder time of really gaining those awakening skills. But again, I had huge trauma, and look what I'm doing now. I'm teaching people how to do it. The other thing I want to talk about is dopamine. Dopamine is the ability to invoke you to do a certain response. So if your dopamine is programmed to be addictive of sugar, to be addictive of cocaine, if you have a more addictively programmed brain, because of how the dopamine response system is happening. And let's say you've tried Coke, or you've done pot, or you drink alcohol or food or whatever is that addictive brain. The dopamine tells you it will release when it has a cue for you to act out and do something again. And if that something again is something that's not supportive of higher consciousness, it's going to be harder for you to support higher consciousness. And then there's serotonin, the happy neurotransmitter. If you do not have a lot of serotonin naturally in your system, it can be harder. But again, the 5 steps I teach, actually I teach 5 steps, 5 skills, and 5 spiritual laws, but don't have time to talk about that completely, can actually help shift the dopamine negative response system, can actually promote healthy serotonin, can actually promote healthy neuroplasticity, the development of procedural memory, and ways to overcome a traumatic wired brain. So just in review, we've got this brain, we've got a monkey brain, we've got a mouse brain, and a reptile brain. How it's programmed can either support higher consciousness or make it harder for you. So let's talk about the nervous system. So in a healthy nervous system, if you're in a parasympathetic mode, a relaxed state, the activated fight, flight, freeze is not activated. Your fight, flight, freeze is not activated. And you have a healthy nervous system and somebody goes boo, you'll go quickly into the sympathetic nervous system, and then you'll quickly downregulate. But what happens in an overtaxed or stressed nervous system, it's like you have the gas and brake on at the same time, and that you stay in this middle ground of reactivity, and you don't ever completely downregulate. And that not only affects your health, and it affects your ability to really be in that calm state of higher awareness and spiritual awakening. And I would say that your nervous system is almost more important than even heart health, because it affects heart health. Everybody's like, oh, exercise, take care of your heart. Well, I say take care of your nervous system, because if it's not healthy, you're not only more prone to getting like diseases like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, but it's hard for spiritual awakening. And they also have this heart rate variability test that determines your stress level. And if you haven't had a heart rate variability test, I encourage you to have one. Most chiropractors can do this test on their machine. It helps you understand what is the health of your nervous system. So your nervous system determines so much about whether you are going to be in a conditioned, you think about conditioning your muscles for a run. Well, if your nervous system isn't conditioned for higher consciousness, it's hard to obtain that spiritual awakening. I think it's really important to think about the brain and body systems and the biochemicals in the brain and body systems as are you set up biologically, or as I call it, the biological consciousness container? Are you set up to run that marathon? Have you done the training and the exercises so that your brain and body systems are set up in a way for you to really have a better chance of having a higher level of spiritual awakening? Another thing that determines spiritual awakening are whether you have sensory integration issues. So one of the things that has come out is that if there is a brain disorder, you're going to be more sensitive to even touch or light or sound. And that, if that activates your nervous system, if that makes it harder to be around, for instance, people with Asperger's or autism. Technically, Asperger's isn't a diagnosis anymore. It's more of the continuum of autism. So if you were born with a more sensory brain, or as some people call them, highly sensitive people, you're going to have quicker triggers to bring you out of your center. So you're going to have to really look at how do you support your biological consciousness container, your brain, your body, and the biology of your being, so that you are better supportive toward higher consciousness. I want to talk a little bit about something called polyvagal theory that Stephen Porges discovered, and I'm not going to go into it's very complicated polyvagal theory, and I don't pretend to understand all of it, but it's about the vagus nerve. I just want to talk a bit about the vagus nerve that connects the body. It goes through all the organs of the body. It's the social engagement. It has all the facial muscles. And if there's something called a dorsal vagal complex, if the vagus nerve through the muscles of connection through the face are not activated, and if they're not running properly, it's hard to create connection. You want something called high vagal tone that has that connection of the vagus nerve through the face and the body and the organs, so that it is designed to have social connection and healthy connection. And so polyvagal theory, what's happening with the vagus nerve, can either support higher awakening or not. So bottom line, your ability to downregulate your nervous system when you should is really an important ability in order to achieve higher consciousness and spiritual awakening. And then there's mirror neurons. I love the concept of mirror neurons. So what they basically do is say, like, if my daughter watches me bake a cake, it's the mirror neurons and as she watches it, it's like she baked the cake herself. Like, I would always want to watch my dressage trainer. big into dressage, ride my horse, because I learned so much because the mirror neurons are like, I'm doing the same thing. I'm riding the horse. So if our mirror neurons have watched your parents drink alcohol, if they've watched your negative interactions of your parents, it's like you were doing that as a kid. And then there's got to be reprogramming that happens around that in order to achieve higher consciousness. And again, I teach the 5 steps, 5 skills, and 5 spiritual laws on how to do that is my way. But whether you use my way or you discover your own way, it's really important to empower yourself to realize that if you've watched something happen again and again and again, it's going to be harder for you to change that activity because it's as if you had done it yourself. So, what am I saying with all this? We've got polyvagal theory in the vagus nerve. We've got dopamine. We've got oxytocin. We've got serotonin. We've got the primal brain. We've got the limbic brain. We've got the nervous system. We've got all these biochemical things happening. We've got DNA. Yet we have epigenetics that says that not all DNA is necessarily going to be expressed. Just because you have the gene for cancer doesn't mean you're going to get cancer. But what does it all say? It says that the brain and body and the biology, your brain, body, and biology are the vehicle that can drive the car toward higher spiritual awakening or crash. So the question is, if your brain, body, and biology are the car, who's driving the car? Hopefully, I call it my core being, my higher self, my higher mind, my divine mind. Hopefully, the driver of your car is your higher consciousness and not your wounded self. I teach 5 spiritual laws, and one of the spiritual laws is your sense of self creates your reality. If you're resonating at the wounded part, you're going to create a reality that's based on that lower frequency. If you're connected to your higher self, your core being, you're going to create a reality that is going to drive your car not into a crash, but into a spiritual awakening. So on some level, what I want you to take from this so far is, yes, if you have sensory integration issues, if you had trauma as a kid, if you have challenges in how your limbic system reacts to stress and challenge, if you get triggered easily, if you have a lot of defensive reactivity, you can change. There is neuroplasticity. There is a way to access a higher vibration of a wholeness of consciousness to drive the vehicle of your brain, body, and biology. Or as I like to say, you have a biological consciousness container that limits your ability for higher awareness, for spiritual awakening. But you can be a better driver in redesigning and reshaping how that is done. In other words, the mind is not the brain. Consciousness is the driver. The brain is only the vehicle, and it can be awakened or wounded. So you can learn the skills to transform your brain and biology to higher consciousness, rewire it so that you have more choice. I personally don't always have choice. Sometimes I'm reactive, but I have more choice every year because I really work on bringing the skills of transformation, of spiritual awakening into my brain and biology, into my procedural memory, in to help shift my nervous system back to a healthier state so I've got more cards in my deck that are aces instead of jokers. Which brings me to my favorite topic, something called metacognitive reality that Ron Siegel coined that phrase. It's basically the awareness, the ability to see thoughts as just thoughts and to see their origin, to determine if they have value or if they are just the result of running a program below the surface. So I want to give you an invitation to drop below the thought stream and pay attention to sensations in the body, is what he said. But I say sensations and the energetics of the sensations and the thoughts in the brain and body system. And that's what my work is all about. But let's talk about this concept of metacognitive reality and how it affects not only your energy system, but it affects your brain and body system and your ability to have oxytocin so that you're differentiated from your partner, so that you don't lose yourself in the relationship, so that you can regulate your nervous system when your partner is sad. You don't have to be sad along with them, right? So if you see thoughts and emotions as simply energetic constructs and they don't define your value or who you are, I teach that thoughts and emotions are simply energetic constructs, and we'll talk about this later. That as you learn to connect to the emotions that hold low vibrational consciousness, like emotional pain, abandonment, sadness, anger, hopelessness, that if you see those not as who you are, again, metacognitive reality, you can then transform them. You can then be a better driver of the car, of your brain and body systems. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. So there was a great study about social pain, social abandonment. They did a study where they stimulated part of the brain for 15 minutes. And then they did a game, a volleyball game, where some people were excluded. And the students that were excluded, the participants that were excluded, that didn't have the stimulation, felt much more hurt and overwhelmed than those that that had the stimulation. So is it a guarantee that you have to have social pain? No, you can learn how to self-regulate even around something as difficult as social pain. So what does the research say on how to change the brain? Well, obviously there's been tons of research on mindfulness practices. And because of the MRI, they're now able to really have more sophisticated studies. Before, the studies were like after a meditation, people would self-report and fill out a questionnaire, but now they have much more sophisticated studies on that topic. And also the whole concept of epigenetics that Bruce Lipton talks about, and that consciousness can create a change in whether the genes are expressed or not. It's really important to understand that genes are just the blueprint. They are not necessarily the outcome. Awareness, thoughts, and emotions throughout the day, as somebody is more conscious of those awareness, thoughts, and emotions throughout the day, they have studied that leads to a higher level of joy, a higher level of consciousness. So simply being aware of yourself creates higher consciousness. They've learned that in romantic love, it only lasts a short amount of time. And then the effects of that romantic love can wear off unless you find some novelty. When the neurotransmitters of love initially wear off, some say that it only lasts a year, if that, for some people. But if you bring novelty into the relationship, you get more of that oxytocin and you promote longer term love. So you can really change the brain that way. And again, I just want to bring up the importance of the separation of self. And that oxytocin does promote bonding with your kids or with somebody else, but it also helps support differentiation. So there is no merging of self and losing of self in the other. Some other research shows, again, about the probiotics in the rats. I want to remind you. And also just want to bring up nutrition and that you are what you eat. And that's an obvious connection, that if you eat in unhealthy ways, it does affect your ability to self-regulate. And in terms of that procedural memory, where you can have a bottom-up system, as they call it, versus a top-down, the brain down, a more bottom-up system of creating a structure and a system for higher consciousness and spiritual awakening, is external cues work in helping develop positive procedural memory. For instance, with the example of HM, for him to remember to do certain things, they put post-it notes around. So I tell my clients, here's post-it notes. Differentiate. You are not your negative emotions. Your false self is not you. You are spiritually whole. Work the 5 steps, skills and spiritual laws. And even setting, I would have them set their iPhone timer to buzz once an hour, just to tune into their brain and body systems and be aware of, where am I today? Am I connected to my bigger self, my spiritual wholeness, or not? So external cues are proven to help support the development of procedural memory. There's a great study that said 1/3 of all healings are placebo. Drug, surgery, energy healings, 1/3 of all healings are placebo. And I think that's powerful, when sometimes you just have to trick the brain into believing you're healthy. I had a client come in who was quite clear that her psychosis was linked to evil energy. And I'm not saying that there isn't evil energy. I've worked with people where there has been, call it evil energy in their field, and removing it took away the symptoms, but that wasn't her case. So instead of saying, no, that's not true, I put her on the table like a shaman would and, exorcised a demon from her, and she never had psychosis again. It's the power of, thinking. The power of thinking is quite profound. It's important to also talk about, Bruce Lipton talks about the nocebo effect, and that is the negative perception of belief that a person is going to have a disease. For instance, if the doctor says, well, you've got a 20% chance of living, that can affect the person's view and perception that they're doomed. And there's a nocebo effect. So just really be conscious that, yes, there's a great placebo effect, but there's also a nocebo effect. Another study with LeBron James was reported in this study about he would talk to LeBron. LeBron, you need to do this. LeBron was thinking this. LeBron was thinking this. And he would talk to himself in the third person. And they actually studied it. And people who speak to themselves in that third person really help promote higher consciousness, more joy, more self-esteem. And what I've been teaching my students over the years and clients is be kind to your human, talk to her or him. So I would say, Carolyn, oh my gosh, you must be in so much pain to have reacted that way. Or I'll start laughing and say, oh, Carolyn, that was silly of you to do. I'm so sorry. Your human self is just so limited, and fitting all this higher consciousness in it with how your brain and body systems, you just sometimes can't do things as well, as you make mistakes. I'm so sorry, Carolyn. I'm sending you so much love and support. So speaking to yourself in the third person is really an important skill. I want to talk also about that concept of differentiation, that it's really important for you to differentiate your sense of self from your mistakes, from your negative emotions and ego thoughts. And that creates a level of resiliency. There's so many studies that talk about what creates resiliency. In one study, they looked at some kids that were trapped on a bus and they couldn't get out, and the kids that actually fought their way out ended up not having PTSD, and those that didn't fight their way out, that waited to be saved, were less resilient. So supporting resiliency is really important. This was a Harvard study they did, that they seem to indicate that people look for happiness in the wrong places, and they don't always think something small is going to bring them so much happiness. So they had some students put some minor items in a time capsule that they opened 3 months later, and those minor items that they thought wouldn't bring them that much happiness when they got there brought them a huge amount of happiness. So look for happiness in the right places. And then it's important to talk about spiritual practices can be used to enhance cognition, communication, and creativity. And over time, they can change our neural perception of reality itself. And I really want to promote that, because how we perceive the world and ourselves actually creates our reality. And so if you have a spiritual practice that can change your perception and your cognition and your creativity, it really does support spiritual awakening. When we practice self-reflection, observing the inner maps and voices in our brain, we begin to develop a deeper level of consciousness that taps into the intuitive wisdom of the brain. When this happens, we have that aha experience that gives us new insight into the nature of the world and ourselves. The more we meditate, the more this new level of awareness feels real. This is one of the mindfulness researchers wrote that. Also says that people who treat themselves with compassion feel better about themselves and their bodies. I call it Be Kind to Your Human. I actually have a website. It's not a great website, but a website called BeKindToYourHuman.com, because I think that's what we're really talking about. As you learn to self-identify as your spiritual wholeness, sending love and kindness to the human parts of you, life changes, your brain changes, your body changes, your biochemicals changes, and your DNA can change. So again, where's the sense of self, and which sense of self is found there? It's, according to the studies of dementia and Alzheimer's patients, it's located in the right frontal lobe. appears to govern personality, including one's religious, social, political beliefs, and even the dress. Damage to the right frontal lobe of the brain by the disease creates radical changes in the identities of patients, according to this study. And I guess what I say there is not only is it important, so your sense of self can change, is the fundamental lesson. So what I'm supporting you in saying, please work the 5 steps, 5 skills, and 5 spiritual laws that I'm going to try and teach you at the end of this, at least give you a taste of. And if not, I've got a workshop coming on the 19th through 20th and an online class called The Secret Code that can help you learn those skills so that you can change your sense of self and change your reality. Because perception is really the cause of pain. And you change your perception, you can change your reality. Thoughts, beliefs, and emotions are malleable because they are rooted in perception. You don't want to live your life with a nocebo. You really want to awaken to the deeper truth of your wholeness. So I'm going to give you an invitation to rethink and reconsider everything that you were once told is fact, such as if you get breast cancer, if you have those genes for cancer, that you're definitely going to get cancer. That's just not true. You are so much more powerful than that. There is this bigger self who can be in charge. And here's the energetics. Going to get into the energy system now. I've talked about the brain and body system and their ability to support higher consciousness, and now I want to talk about the energy system. So there is an actual energetic vortex for your true self, your spiritual wholeness, your core being. And you can actually learn how to self-regulate your mind, energy, and body systems back to that bigger self. So one of the principles of energy is quantum physics, is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that the observer influences the outcomes, the reality. So when there were energy waves were observed, they turned into particles. So simply watching something can change it. There used to be a view of Newtonian physics that everything was solid. And now there's this quantum view that everything is simply particles of energy that resonates at higher frequencies and lower frequencies. In the energy work I teach, the higher frequencies really can, the energetic constructs, the energetic frequencies of that quantum reality are physical representations of consciousness. Now, I can't prove that in the research, but I can prove that through helping you experience that directly with yourself, that energy is consciousness, and it is the tangible tool that connects the mind with the body. So what is that mind-body connection? What is the medium that connects them? It is the energetic system. And simply by learning how to connect to the consciousness within the energy system, you can change pain to power. You can change grief to wisdom. You can change fear to courage. You can change insecurity to confidence. So how does subtle energy changes to influence health and well-being? Well, there's this thing called entrainment. Zimmerman did a study of therapeutic touch practitioners, and he used a device called the squid, and he had a healer run energy, and they could actually record the fields. They've done so many studies, probably more studies on the brain and body systems because they're funded. The studies on the energy field are not as well funded, and they're fewer, but they could actually rate how many hertz there was. And they could actually do studies where if one frequency was held, the person's, the other frequency matched it. It's called entrainment. So if I resonate love and it's really big in the room, your energy system will be entrained to resonate at that same well-being frequency. They've done a lot of energy research on depression, and this picture shows this low magnetic field that was stimulated in order to help people move out of depression. And that was actually a study that was reported in the Harvard Gazette on the magnetic energy to prevent depression. And then there was another energy device called the magnetic wand that helps schizophrenics and obsessive compulsives control their behavior. And supposedly it helps blind people learn Braille more. And growing more seeds, they used energy and sound together. 19% increase in seeds, reduction in tumors, and Harvard Medical School study showed that the ancient energy practices, had positive effect on genes and the chronically stressed. So there's not a ton, but there's significant research documenting the benefits of energy work. So the brain is an energetic tool. They did another study at Caltech that the brain is filled with energy fields, and the fields that were once thought to be just bugs of sorts actually are energetic fields that they're still trying to understand. So I guess the point I'd like to make is, as we move into the energy part of this talk, is that brain can actually, when the mind, the higher mind, the bigger mind, the spiritual awakened mind connects to the brain, it can be used as an energetic tool for healing and consciousness raising. So I want to take the research that we talked about into daily life so I can help you understand how the emotional pain can actually transform at that quantum level, at that biological level, at that level of DNA, in all three mind, energy, and body systems to power. Because you are not your pain. If you feel you are your negative emotions and life challenges and beliefs, you'll actually create more pain for yourself. Yet your false self, if it becomes entangled into those emotions and challenges, it will lower your frequency to the level of pain, and thus transformation can't happen. So regardless of the challenge you face or your beginnings, you can actually rewire your brain and body system to foster spiritual awakening. You can transform your self-identity as your true self to be core being. Because you can't laugh wrong, but you can cry in a manner that rewounds you. You can feel anger and fear and anxiety in a manner that hurts you. What I teach is not processing emotions, because we know that processed food isn't good for you. Well, from that energetic level, neither are processed emotions, because how you feel determines if you heal. This is when pain can either become the energetic portal back to spiritual awakening, wisdom, and creation, or it can rewound you. And so when you look at emotions, when you look at everything as energetic constructs, you can then see that there is a consciousness that holds a high vibration. And if that high vibration of consciousness is brought into sadness and hate and insecurity, through entrainment, if there's enough high vibration, through entrainment, those lower frequencies can actually shift to a higher frequency of wholeness. So pain Emotional pain such as sadness or hate can transform to wisdom, love, insecurity to power, stress to positive creation. But if the trauma stays so big in your consciousness so that your mind feels you are the trauma and your energy feels shrinks to the size of the trauma, you won't transform. You will just keep looping over the same emotions and beliefs. Here's a picture of an energy field filled with trauma and emotions. And here's the energy field when it transforms. That's what you can do if you learn my 5 steps, my 5 skills, and 5 spiritual laws. And I'm not saying mine is the only way, but it is the foundation of a successful program. And I'll talk more about it. Most of you know about chakras and know that they're actual emotional frequencies and how the chakras rotate. They're actual energy vortices. And as they rotate, that chakra system rotates, they either hold negative emotions or they support higher consciousness. And you can learn how to connect to the emotions that are held in the chakras in a way that the lower vibrational emotions transform. This is the energy of magnetic energy. If you remember that guy that had his head in the magnetic field, you can learn how to resonate magnetic energy so that you support positive intention for higher awareness. Kind of cool, right? So, what do I mean by transformation? This is a video I did for my online class, the Secret Code Self-Mastery class. And I look at, as a symbol, that white paint in that class as high vibrational consciousness. It's the higher mind, it's the spiritual wholeness, it's the divine essence of your true self or core being. And that black paint, that little dot of black paint that's there as that wounded self, that false self, that negative biology and negative wiring in the brain, the limbic reactivity. And if you have enough higher frequency of energy at that quantum level, it can actually transform. So anger can transform to power, sadness, depression, anxiety, to wisdom, wholeness, and positive creation. So that's a metaphor right there of what you're seeing of the transformation process. As you learn how to implement these 5 steps, 5 skills, and 5 spiritual laws, where the energy of low vibrational consciousness transforms to higher vibrational consciousness. Because how you feel determines if you heal and if the brain and body and energy system changes or if it'll stay the same. It's how you feel. How do you connect to the emotion and the false self? Whether you're differentiated or individualized from the pain determines so much about how you're going to feel it. So quickly, the 5 steps to awaken wholeness. Step 1 is awareness of who's in charge. Is it your core being or your wounded self? Step 2, you have to have that detachment and differentiation. And there is an energetic construct that helps support that. It's magnetic energy. And I teach people how to resonate their magnetic energy in their brain and body systems to support a differentiation and a lack of merging. So steps 1 and 2 together is when you know how not to be. Your sense of self is not being the emotional pain. There's kindness, there's self-love, there's that detachment. And then step 3 is when you name, own, and claim what is asking for love and transformation. Is it anger at your husband? Is it sickness? Is it a negative sense of self, insecurity, a feeling you can't go forward? How do you feel it then in a way to transformation. That's step 4. I'm going to ask you to learn how to understand the root of it, what is the past of it. But there's a specific energetic frequency and technique that I call the enlightened observer, of how you connect to that enlightened observer. In the past, so many of my clients were rewounded during their meditation practice. And they said, well, I tried to have an objective observer, but the objective observer was objectively overwhelming them, watching them rewound. I want that frequency of the mind to be resonating at that white paint. So when it feels the emotional pain, that metaphorical dark plane transforms. And that is step 5. When you're able to shift the emotional pain, the lower vibrational consciousness in all 3 mind, energy, body systems back to your true self. You have to do that like 100 times a day because of the negative bias of the brain. In one of Rick Hanson's latest books, he talks extensively about the negative bias of the brain. And, you have to implement a system. I say 100 times a day. Work the 5 steps, skills, and spiritual laws throughout your day. Set your timer, put post-its notes so it becomes part of your procedural memory. Because you are your wholeness. You are the truth of who you are. And you deserve to shine like the whole universe is yours. Live from that deep knowledge that you are not the pain you feel. Because peace, it does not mean to be in a place where there is no noise, trouble, or hard work. It means to be in the midst of those things and still be calm in your heart. And I'm ending with this picture that I took on safari in Zimbabwe. And I just felt this magical moment, and I looked up and I caught it. And I just want to leave you guys with the belief and knowledge that every moment is a magical moment that you can awaken to as you learn how to transform emotional pain and life challenge back to wisdom, wholeness, and the truth of who you are. And do it with love and kindness to yourself. And I'm sending you love and kindness along your way. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or needs. And I'm inviting you to come to my workshop on the 19th through the 20th. And you can learn more about how conflict and difficulty can actually bring deeper intimacy. So when you have an argument with somebody or you have a disagreement with somebody, that is actually the good news. Because as you approach that disagreement, you can actually not only awaken more of your wholeness, but create more intimacy and connection in your life. Sending you love and blessings along the way.